Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this fourth seminar in the Shock of the Record series, organised by the British Records Association in partnership with the Institute of Historical Research. My name is Jane Winters, and I'm Professor of Digital Humanities at the School of Advanced Study in the University of London. This evening, we're going to be talking about archives of crisis and conspiracy, the digital future. Web archives are going to be mentioned a lot, so before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I'm very briefly going to describe what web archiving is, with apologies to those of you in the audience who know much more about this than I do. So just sharing my screen. So what is web archiving? And I owe this wonderful explanation to colleagues at the National Archives of the UK who produced this guidance in 2011. Web archiving is the process of collecting websites and the information that they contain from the World Wide Web and preserving these in an archive. Web archiving is a similar process to traditional archiving of paper or parchment documents. The information is selected, stored, preserved, and made available to people. But as the web contains a massive amount of websites and information, web archivists typically use automated processes to collect websites. The process involves harvesting websites from their locations on the live web using specially designed software. This type of software is known as a crawler. Crawlers travel across the web and within websites, copying and saving the information as they go. And then the end of the process, the archived websites and the information they contain are made available online as part of web archive collections. These can be viewed, read, and navigated as they were on the live web, but are preserved as snapshots of the information at particular points in time. And I owe this animation of what a web crawler is doing to one of our speakers today, Kees Teszelszky. And this is the process that's going on behind the scenes as every single element on a page of a website is archived. And that leads you to this, which is the kind of thing that you will see if you go to a web archive. This is the earliest capture from December 1996 of the website of the Institute of Historical Research, which was then not described as a website, but as a hypertext internet server. Most of you will be most familiar with web archives through the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which has ambitions to archive the web globally. But there is also some fantastic work which is going on in various national libraries and archives. You'll hear about some of that this evening. And this, for example, is a snapshot of the special collections that are held at the UK Web Archive at the British Library. But after that, now over to the people that you're really here to listen to. We have three main speakers who will talk for around 10 minutes each. Valérie Schafer is Professor in Contemporary European History in the Centre for Contemporary and Digital History at the University of Luxembourg. Her main research interests are the history of the internet and the web, the history of European digital cultures and infrastructures, and born digital heritage, especially web archives. Friedel Geeraert is an expert in web archiving at the Royal Library of Belgium. Her research interests include the value of web archives for historical research, the processes of web archiving, the importance of national web archive infrastructures, and the intersections between web and social media archives. And I think that gap between web archives and social media archives is something that we will talk about today. And Kees Teszelszky is Curator of Digital Collections at the National Library of the Netherlands. He's an early modern historian originally and has moved into much more contemporary areas. His research covers the selection, harvest, and presentation of web archive and other born digital sources, web archaeology, the harvesting of online news, and historical sources in a post-truth era. And finally, the discussion this evening will be moderated by Dr. David Coast. David is a reader in early modern history at Bath Spa University. His research focuses on the political, cultural, and social history of early modern England. So we have two early modernists on this panel about very contemporary archives, with a particular interest in news, rumour, and public opinion. He's co-investigator on a research project exploring COVID-19 rumours in historical perspective, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. And the final thing from me is we'd encourage you to post questions and comments in the Q&A throughout the presentations, and David will pose as many of them as we have time for to our speakers. But now I'll hand over to Valérie to get the discussion started.
Thank you very much, Shen, and good evening to everybody. I first want to thank the organizers of this webinar. It's a pleasure to be there with you. Also, the topic, of course, is very serious. And I start with a small memory for you, Jane. You should recognize this paper because we worked on it together. It was a few years ago. It was in 2016 when we were working together on a project which was entitled ASAP, Archive Sauvegarde Attentat Paris. It was related to the terrorist attacks that happened in 2015. And there we had a discussion about emergency collections of web archives. It was not the first time, of course, there were emergency or living collections, but this one was huge in France at the BNF, at the INA, both institutions which are archiving the web in France. And we started with questions like, why emergency collections related to crises? For what, where, when, and so on. And this is what I will also follow this evening. Of course, web archiving has strongly evolved already within a few years, but these questions, they remain very important. So why and when, web archives of crisis? So there are many events and types of crises that were documented and that are still documented. That maybe terrorist attacks. And of course, it didn't start with the terrorist attacks in France. You have some web archives of the London attacks, for example, at the UK Web Archives. But September 11 was also a key milestone, unfortunately, in the wish to preserve born digital heritage. Then you may have earthquakes and other natural crises, I would say, but also political crises. Wars, we will come back to the current war between Russia and Ukraine in a few minutes. And of course, there are asymmetries. For example, if you want to compare the web archives of Ebola and of COVID, you see that COVID was of more interest, I will say worldwide, than Ebola, which is not so well documented. I should add also that, of course, for this crisis, there is not only born digital heritage, but that you have also many other things that may be preserved, of course, official papers and so on, but also for terrorist attacks. For example, the tributes to the victims in Paris and in other places were also preserved. So here are a few examples of this kind of web archives of crisis. For example, earthquake in Haiti, it was in 2010, then documenting Ferguson and the murder of Michael Brown and all the movements that followed, which are also related to Black Lives Matter. And here it was more organized by, as you may read, Washington University and St. Louis area universities with also organizations. And then an example, of course, of the UK Web Archives talking about crisis. Brexit is a political crisis that was also leading to a special collection. Within these collections of web archives of crisis, there are many stakeholders. I already mentioned on my last screen the earthquake. It is a collection that was monitored, I will say, by Archiveit, which is linked to Internet Archive. Documenting Ferguson, it was universities and associations, while the UK Web Archives is, of course, a national initiative, which is also led by the British Library and by so official, I would say, stakeholders within the area of heritagization. And here, two examples, DocNo, which was related to this Ferguson movement and Black Lives Matter with George Floyd and others. They continue to archive social networks, as well as born digital heritage. And a recent one is Susho, unfortunately, Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage, which was led, but as you may read, it's more related to cultural heritage, and it's led by cultural heritage professionals, librarians, and others that reacted very quickly after the beginning of the war, seeing that the cultural heritage was, of course, at risk. You have, of course, also National Library of Medicine, for example, for the COVID crisis. You have the BNL, but also the BNF in France. BNL is in Luxembourg, and other libraries who are archiving the web on a daily basis, I will say, and reacted also to the COVID crisis. And then you have also international collections, one which is famous and that we are currently studying is the International Internet Preservation Consortium collection related to novel coronavirus. And this was a shared initiative of 30 web archives and other stakeholders that came together thanks to the invitation of the IPC to help preserve this born digital heritage. Of course, there is another question when a crisis is arising. When do you start and when do you stop also the special collection? And in the case of the COVID crisis, it was especially a problem because after the first wave, we saw unfortunately that it will continue and for eventually many months. And you may see on this wonderful project, the COVID tracking project, that they decided to stop in March 2021. And this is, of course, a question which is very important for the people preserving the born digital heritage. When do you start? When you can. For example, for the terrorist attacks, for Charlie Hebdo, there was a small delay before librarians were able to react. But to stop is also a question, and Archivit at the time of the terrorist attacks also explained that they were, and it's the case in many web archiving institutions, a very small team. There is also questions related to budget and so on. So you can't put all data, all your budget and all the people who are creating the web on a crisis and just a crisis, because there are also other goals and missions. Then why web archives of crisis and why web archivists and people are reacting? There are many reasons. Of course, the feeling that you are living an historical and disruptive event, but also emotions need to contribute. This was very clear, for example, during the terrorist attacks. Many also individual initiatives arose, like the one by Nick Riest, for example, preserving Twitter. And there is also an ability, if you have the technical ability, because if you don't have it, then it's difficult. Of course, you have to find another way to contribute. A feeling of duty, something which is also linked to heritage. Of course, the ID, and you have also legal deposit and also, a frame which is defining also the goals and the missions of libraries, and preserving, of course, this heritage is at stake. But what does a web archives of crisis look like? I would like to underline that it may depend of course, the institution or the people who are archiving the web. So there are perimeters, and especially in libraries with national frame, but there are also choices of curation you may define if you want to. You can never archive everything. So you have also to make a selection. If you want also to invite people to contribute, so the question of participation is of course very important. The question of scale, an event which is outside your perimeter for National Library, it is of course a problem. It is not, you can't decide that you will archive an event, for example, in Canada, if you are a French national institution, or it should be related also in some ways to France. And of course, of platforms, there are a lot of social media and platforms that are currently not really preserved. Examples may be, for example, TikTok, which was really important during the COVID crisis. Fortunately, there are also web pages related to TikTok, that, like the one I'm showing, but the content of TikTok were not preserved so well. Facebook is a bit tricky, YouTube, Twitter are better preserved, it may depend. And then also the access and what your archive looks like may depend also of the interfaces, the way there are plenty of metadata or way to search within the web archives. And here you have two examples for the terrorist attacks of different ways to search, to use tools, because libraries also embed a lot of tools related not only to web content, but also all the data about users, timeline, temporalities, and so on, that may also be displayed in a visual mode. To conclude, what do they share? They are very different stakeholders, different interfaces, sometimes platforms that are not archived, but they share immediacy, flexibility. They are in some ways, at some point, live living archives, and noise and silences, of course. You miss things and you have also a lot of noise. And what should they share? This is a question for the future. Probably inclusiveness. An initiative like DocKnow was also created in order to reflect the Black Lives Matter movement, with the idea that it was not correctly or enough preserved. So some values, of course. Documentation and context. This is what we are trying to do within the WorkNet project, but Friedel will talk about it, but also conducting oral interviews with web archivists to know a bit more about the collection. Interoperability, we may hope in the future, but it's quite difficult. Interoperability of metadata, yeah, of web content and of tools. And I don't know if we must dream about it, but we have, of course, problems of interoperability. Sustainability, retrievability, of course, are key for the future and for the studies of this crisis. And finally, the question of memories. For example, when you stop your collection, when it's terrorist attacks, and then you have the trials, you have the memories, the anniversaries or of this kind of events, should you archive, find also a place, preserve it or not? This is an open question, and I let it for the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valérie. I think you set up a lot of questions that we can pick up in the discussion later. So I'll now hand over to Friedel, who has been doing some fantastic research into the archiving of the COVID crisis.
Thank you, Jane. Unfortunately, I have a little hiccup because we tested it and now I can't see the PDF as a window. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. View and then full screen mode. So let me go back. There we go. Thank you very much for the introduction, Jane. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. And thank you also to Valérie for setting the scene so well. I will be focusing on a sort of case study, the COVID-19 crisis and how it has been archived, or how the web content related to the COVID-19 crisis has been archived. So this work has been done in the context of the WorkNet network that brings together web archiving professionals and researchers to promote research that will help us to understand the history of transnational events and web domains. So I'm presenting this on behalf of all the members of Working Group 2. So they're listed on this slide. You can read them if you like. So tonight, I would like to take you on a journey into the world of web archiving and shed light on how memory institutions and other organizations have archived web content related to the COVID-19 crisis. So the main challenge of web archivists was to determine how to capture the COVID-19 pandemic on the web in all its diversity so that these testimonies are preserved and made available for future research. What we did was that we conducted in-depth interviews with web archiving practitioners to gain insight into web archiving practices in a number of countries. So Denmark, France, Hungary, Iceland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the UK as well, the Netherlands, Ireland, the United States, and also the IAPC International Internet Preservation Consortium Collection that was mentioned already by Valérie. I would like to focus on 4 questions with which all web archivists were confronted. So the first 2 are questions of limitations, namely how do you archive a global event on the web on a national level? And how do you decide which topics and types of media to include in the collection? Then the third one is one of inclusion. How do you curate collections that are representative of a whole nation in all its diversity? As Valérie mentioned, it's a challenge and the institutions are well aware of that. And the fourth is how to handle fake news and conspiracy theories related to COVID-19. So on to the first question, how do you archive a global event on a national level? So the Library of Congress and the IAPC Collaborative Collection both have a global collecting focus, but other institutions are mostly national libraries. They try to limit their collecting to the national level in a variety of different ways. So one way is to focus on information published on the national domain, such as .nl for the Netherlands, .fr for France, .dk for Denmark, and so on. Also focusing on information in the national language of the country is another way, although the fact that many countries in Europe share languages complicate this criterion. For example, I remember that the Institut National de l'Audiovisuel in France remarked that they couldn't collect just based on French because part of the information came from Belgium and that was outside of their collecting remit. So other ways of scoping the collections are to focus on information about the country, information published by national citizens or organizations, and information published in the country. Which brings us to the next question, how to decide which topics and types of media to include in the collection. Do you want to archive websites, social media, or even apps? And on top of that, how do you pick the topics that you want to include in the collection? And next to that, or on top of that, the web archivists also need to work within a certain legal framework. And there are also limitations related to technical infrastructure and know-how. So this results in a large variety of approaches. If we take a look at the media each initiative is collecting, it's clear that some initiatives do not collect social media and focus solely on websites, which is the case at the National Libraries of Switzerland, Iceland, Hungary, the Netherlands, Ireland, as well as at the Library of Congress and the IAPC Collaborative Collection. The most popular social media to collect are Twitter and YouTube, which are rather easy to capture, followed by Facebook, which is already a challenge. And Netarkivet at the Royal Danish Library really deserves a special mention because they truly offer a wide selection of social media content related to the COVID-19 crisis, including Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, Twitch, and even some podcasts. If we delve deeper into the topics included in the collection, there's a large variety. So the 3 biggest elements were official government communication and communication by public bodies, news and media, and key organizations and initiatives. But many other topics are also included, such as controversial topics, sports, volunteering, domestic violence, religion, food waste, etc. So the web archives really contain a wealth of information. But how do institutions ensure that they create COVID-19 collections that are representative of a whole nation in all its diversity? So all web archivists agreed that this is a true challenge. Often there is a limited number of curators involved in creating web archive collections, which leads to involuntary subjectivity in the collections and to themes and groups being overlooked. And the fact that web archives remain largely unknown in the world also leads to not receiving many suggestions from the public, which does not help to further inclusivity either. However, many initiatives really try to undertake special efforts to curate collective or inclusive COVID-19 collections. And there are different ways in which this is done. So all of the initiatives we interviewed curate content within the web archiving team to some extent, but in some cases, specific efforts are made to make web archiving a truly transversal activity throughout the institution, going beyond the team responsible for web archiving by inviting nominations from colleagues in other departments. Another way is to partner with external networks of curators, for example, partner libraries in Switzerland and Denmark, specific government departments in Luxembourg, or networks of specialized institutions such as the Royal Colleges of Nursing in the UK. In the case of Luxembourg, the UK, Ireland, and the IPC Collaborative Collection, recommendations from the public were also invited to make the collections more inclusive. So this is a quote taken from the interview with the National Library of Luxembourg. It shows that when the call for public participation was launched, there were some recommendations for websites related to religious communities, which the curator hadn't initially thought of. And because of this suggestion, websites belonging to the different religious communities were then added to the collection. In the Netherlands, a collaboration with a digital heritage network was set up in order to build a national coronavirus collection. And at the Swiss National Library, they rely on a network of partner institutions, mostly libraries and archives, to help curate the COVID-19 collection. So on to the last question, how to handle fake news and conspiracy theories. So there are different approaches. In some COVID-19 collections, this content was excluded, although a record is kept of the URL of the website. Some of the other institutions made conscious efforts to find this type of information and include them in the collection. And others included them, but tried to contextualize these kind of websites or social media. At the BNF in France, for example, specific efforts were made to also include highly controversial topics in the collection. At the Library of Congress, they wanted to include the content in the archive, but since they work with permissions, they always send a letter to the owners of the copyright to ask if they may archive and make available their websites or social media. So they did not want to give these websites with misinformation authority by sending them such a permission letter. So what they did was they archived an aggregator of websites presenting misinformation to the public in order to contextualize it. In the IPC collection, there was one specific case of a website that stated that COVID-19 was a made-up pandemic, and that also had a strong anti-vaccination policy. So the curators of the IPC collection did not want to filter information, but on the other hand, they also did not want to include information that could prove to be dangerous to health. So what they did was they didn't include the website in question in the collection, but they did keep a record of what the content of the website was and why it wasn't added. So there are different ways of dealing with misinformation in the context of COVID-19 web archive collections, which is a very interesting point. If you would like to dig deeper and take a look for yourself, some of the COVID-19 collections are freely accessible online, which is the case for the IPC Collaborative Collection, the Icelandic Web Archive, the National Library of Ireland, and also the Library of Congress. In other cases, copyright unfortunately prevents web archives from making the content freely available online, meaning that the collections are available on site in the reading rooms of the institutions, and in some cases also at partner institutions. Some institutions also work with a permission system. For example, the UK Web Archive tries to obtain an agreement with the copyright owner or ask for their permission if the content can be made freely accessible online. So their collection is partly available and partly not available online. In the case of Netarkivet, so the Danish Web Archive, it's also worth mentioning that remote access and data dumps are possible, but that you have to be a Danish researcher or be associated with a Danish research institute to do so. And in order to further transparency, some initiatives also make the seed lists or metadata of the collections available. So this is, for example, the seed list, so a list of all the URLs that have been captured by the Hungarian National Library. This is an extract from the UK Web Archive, where all the metadata about the collection is freely accessible online, and some of the websites or social media can also be accessed freely online, but most of it isn't. So thank you from the whole working group for your attention. If you want more information about the different collections, please go to the website of WARCnet. All the interviews that I have mentioned are published as transcripts as WARCnet papers. And if you have any questions, we can field them during the Q&A, or you can always contact me via email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Friedel. And I think this is probably a good point to acknowledge just the fantastic archiving effort. If we think back to how uncertain everything was just over 2 years ago, that this archiving activity was able to be launched, and the global collaboration took off so quickly to make sure that there was a record for current policy making and understanding, but also for future historians to understand how all of this played out. And it really does show, I think, the maturity of digital archiving, certain forms of digital archiving and processes. And finally, Kees is going to take us into the realms of conspiracy rather than crisis. So I'll hand over to you, Kees.
Thank you, Cher. Thank you, Jane. Sorry. Well, good evening. My name is Kees Teszelszky. I work as creator of digital collections at KB National Library of the Netherlands. I hope it works now. Yes. So today I will talk about our special web collection of conspiracy theories. I'll speak about what archive and library sources do future researchers need to understand our present society and culture in times of crisis. The question is, of course, how to preserve these sources for researchers and what can we learn about the future on the basis of what we preserved from the past. My message to you is that if we want to understand, preserve, and learn from the present crisis, we should act like time travelers who get stuck in 2022 and who try to understand what's happening today. So what do future researchers of our time need? That's a question we have asking ourselves as a National Library. In 2022, our goal is to build a representative collection of digital-born sources which can be used for future research about our digital culture. My library started in 1992 with mapping the Dutch web by making an online web directory with important sites about the Netherlands, as people thought that what is online would last forever. As it turned out, that was not like that. The collection was used in 2007 to start web harvesting. A web archive was built to prevent the crisis of the digital dark age when all is lost what has been online. So I've acted as a kind of time traveler when doing digital humanities research on the content of this web archive in 2017. The question was, what kind of image of our digital society could be drawn if a future researcher would use our web archive as the sole source of our current history? Well, it turned out that based on the content of the web archive, the average Dutch is a male, reading books at home, collecting art, visiting museums, is a member of cultural society, and minding his own business, according to the nature of the websites we have selected for our web archive. And here's an image of that person. The web archive is thus not a mirror of the actual Dutch digital society. Therefore, we were called a web archive of innocence for a reason. But this is not only because of our selection policy, but also due to the Dutch law. We have to notify the owner that we want to archive his or her site, and we are legally responsible for what is in our digital collection. Therefore, we can add questionable books to our library collection, but we cannot save the website with exactly the same content as in the book. Still, we needed to change our selection policy to become a true mirror of our digital society, especially in times of crisis. Nowadays, most people do not go to the library to study books if they need information. Sharing opinions and information is also not something that happens only through books and newspapers. People inform themselves and spread their thoughts through digital media. We need to know what people think they know and where did they find that information. It means that we need to search for sources in a different way than we have done before. History is digitally happening before our eyes, but is also disappearing before we can archive it. We must select now. There's no time for historic distance to source material like we have done in the past when collecting books and archive material. In modern times, digital preservation started with analog context. We spoke to academics involved in research on conspiracy theories, professionals who study crisis and conspiracies, and of course, the believers in conspiracy theories themselves. Well, I can tell you, if you want to feel like a time traveler from another planet, get in contact with these people. But still, thanks to them, we got our hands on digital sources we could have never found ourselves. This is a typical end-time website which is predicting the apocalypse since 1998. It's a true digital mirror of our times. All current crises and new technology are turned into conspiracy material. Many Dutch conspiracy sites warn about the end of times which will be near. These ideas are often combined with extreme religious views and guides how to isolate from society and prepare yourself from the coming crisis and disaster. We did not read often about these kind of people in daily news till 2019, when a grandfather and sect leader was found who kept his family in hostage on a farm for 9 years, but also made a website and even vlogs. There are many similar websites in our collection, so I wouldn't be surprised if there are more groups like this active in the Netherlands. We analyzed the websites in the web collection and could divide the sites according to a number of themes. Some are familiar and typical for that year, like climate change, but others became more important in our current time, like health. But the common feature is that they are very critical towards society, government, and what they call mainstream media. And when we did the link analysis, we saw that it turned out that video became incredibly important for conspiracy theorists to spread their ideas. We also spotted one blog which acted as a kind of gate to hell of all sites, as most conspiracy sites link to it. It's not a conspiracy site itself, but a provoking news blog we call a shock blog or shock log, on which many conspiracy thinkers are actively discussing with each other. In 2017, there was a broad discussion about Russian fake news and disinformation in the Netherlands. It's quite telling that from the 500 sites we selected for our web collection, no less than 222 had links to Russian disinformation sites from the homepage. It was also very interesting that when sites like Russia Today were forced to go offline during the first week of the war in Ukraine in March, some influential Dutch conspiracy thinkers posted the question on social media how they will be informed about the news now. And I'm very curious what will happen now these main source of conspiracy theories dried up. So what we saw in 2017 was that conspiracy thinkers use the old media and information and turn it into conspiracy theories which are spread on websites and social media. What we have seen in our collection is that conspiracy theories start to grow online between 2000 and 2017 due to the power of the website as online medium, the growing use of video, the importance of social media and algorithms, which formed closed virtual networks which turned against the old media and analog authority. During the corona pandemic crisis, virtual communities organized themselves online and went offline to the streets to protest against the government. Due to the fact that there was a true crisis, virtual fears and conspiracy thoughts became analog reality in their eyes. Digital resistance turned into physical violence in the Netherlands. The goal was to get virtual attention and analog influence. And what we see now after 2 years of Corona is a growing interplay between the virtual community online and the analog reality. People act on the streets and in parliament like their conspiracy theories are real. The crisis in everyday life, like fear of the war in Ukraine, growing consumer price and feelings of insecurity about the future are fueling these thoughts. We are now living in a new post-digital reality and have to be used that many people can't make a difference anymore between analog and virtual reality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Kees. And I will now hand over to David, who is going to respond and then moderate the discussion. And just a reminder to everybody, any questions that have occurred to you during the presentations, please do add them to the Q&A, and we would love to discuss them.
Yes, absolutely. I'll just reiterate that we have had a question or two already in the Q&A, and I'm sure the discussion will throw up further questions. But so please do go ahead and ask those. Gosh, what a wonderful series of presentations. I think they all actually did a really good job of raising questions themselves, and they all fit together incredibly well. I think, I mean, maybe I sort of had a general question for all of our speakers, just to kick things off. Very broad question, which is that one of the things that struck me sort of to a greater or lesser extent from all of your papers was that a lot of the challenges of web archives are similar to those of traditional archives. You know, problems about what's collected and included, where the gaps are, who can access these archives, ethical issues as well. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what do you think are the unique challenges or problems or difficulties with web archives or, you know, maybe things that are harder to deal with, and which are the sort of issues that are, do you think, sort of common to some extent to all archives? Is there something uniquely sort of challenging about web archives? Yeah, perhaps we can start with Valérie.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are questions related to silences and noises in archives that are well known also for a lot of historians, and especially silences when you go back in the past and you may miss some archives. Question of authenticity in web archive is neither new. What is new? Or at least, there is a change of scale first, because you have billion of web pages. For example, the Wayback Machine since 96 has more than 670 billion of web pages archived. Of course, we won't read all of them, but you may imagine among the data deluge. The fact that we are also talking about data and not just archives, and that with metadata, data, and so on, you can also enter the archive in some ways differently, but with a digitized heritage maybe also. The bottom-up approach within National Archives, you had frames that were very clear. Now you have this human curation, but also a crawler with selecting pages. You are never entirely sure of the content that will be preserved at a T time. So this is also probably a challenge. And updates. When you want to archive, for example, YouTube, Dailymotion, and so on, they are constantly changing also their technical rules and the access and so on. So, and the fact that you have also computer scientists and engineers related to computing who are there to adapt the archiving. And so these are some of the challenges. And uniqueness, I don't know, because when you digitize also archives, you need also to have robots and to have also engineers and so on. So it's not entirely unique, but in some ways here you have some specificities of web archive that I'm sure Friedel and Kees will have other also complementary answers.
Thank you. Kees, you're unmuted, but I'm taking that as you having something to contribute to that question.
Actually, when I read my presentation,
the biggest problem actually that
And Kees, we'll have to stop you there. There's some distortion on your sound.
Yes, there's a sort of Dalek-like effect going on. I'm not sure what, you're not the only one that can hear that, Jane. I wonder, I mean, we can sort of try, yeah, you can try unmuting then. Do you want to try saying something again there, Kees? Oh, I'm afraid it still seems to be a bit odd. Yeah, it makes it really difficult to to hear you, I'm afraid. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll see if we can, if you're able to sort out any technical problems. But in the meantime, hopefully this isn't affecting everyone. Friedel, can we come back to you? So just with a reminder of that question, it's sort of about, you know, if there are any kind of unique problems really for web archives.
Well, Valérie already gave a very elaborate overview, but some other things that were noted in the interviews were, for example, the immediateness, that when something happens, you need to decide if it's important enough to start archiving. So, and when do you start and stop? That was already mentioned by Valérie as well in her presentation. That's one important challenge. Also, you need to monitor it, and you have a list of URLs and social media that you're capturing, maybe related to an event, and then you really need to monitor if it's still relevant or not. For example, a URL can change from year to year. Someone can buy the URL the next year, and then it's a completely different website. So you need to do this active monitoring of your collection. And then another pain point that was mentioned during the interviews is that often there's not a lot of staff to do the actual quality control after the capture. So a lot of the content that is in the archives hasn't been quality checked. So there might be missing elements and so on. Also, and this was already mentioned during the presentations, it's technically very difficult to archive certain platforms. For example, Facebook, they change their conditions so often that even for commercial companies, it's very difficult to offer solutions that are capable of capturing social media content in a manner that's sufficient to be an archival record of those platforms. Also, for Twitter API, for example, there are certain caps, so you can only get a certain amount of tweets. So there are limitations that apply to web archives that aren't applicable, I would say, to more analog sources or more traditional sources.
Brilliant. That's a very full answer. Well, I'm just going to. We've got some questions from our audience that I want to ask here. So first one is from Sarah, and it's a question about who's going to consult the collections. I mean, we obviously also already had Kees mentioning this sort of time traveler who would want to know, you know, what was happening back in 2020. I just wondered if could you tell us a little bit more about who are the anticipated users? I mean, you know, Valérie, you mentioned that the sort of, well, I think Friedel as well, you mentioned the issue of these archives not necessarily always having as much public visibility as they could have, and there being a problem of members of the public not necessarily sort of recommending material for them. So, yeah, who's going to consult the collections? Do you have a sense of that? I mean, Valérie, would you like to?
Yeah, so it's not just about the future, it's about the current time. There are already people who are working on these web archives, and notably in information sciences, but also in computer science also, to test patterns and so on. In history, of course, because web archives started in 96, so there is already in the short term of this digital history, which is changing so fast, a whole history that may be retrieved. And we have some researchers like Niels Brugger, Jan Milligan, and others, Sophie Gebel, I could name a lot of them, who are working on it. But researchers first, and what we should underline is the fact that also for most of the national collections within the frame of the legal deposit or legal frame, you have also to go to the library to use the web archive. So of course it's for researchers, eventually master students and so on, but also journalists, for example. But Internet Archive maybe also is for the general public too, and you can access it very easily. So in the future, I would say more and more researchers for sure will use it, because writing the history of the 90s or of today without the web and without the digital content may seem a bit weird. And then you may also imagine, for example, a company which wants to have a look at its past archive and communication. So there may be also other kind of stakeholders, I would say, and who may be interested in web archives.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to try to bring Kees back, because we've got a couple of questions that are tailor-made for you, because they're very much about disinformation and conspiracy. So we've got one question, first of all, about, this is an interesting one, safe and effective methods of contextualizing disinformation in web and social media archives. So Kees, do you have any suggestions for safe and effective methods of contextualizing disinformation in web and social media archives? I think this is one for Friedel as well, I think.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Oh, I'm so sorry, Kees. I have experienced this one before, and I can't remember exactly what the technical workaround was, but Jane, can I just ask, is there any chance, do you think it would be worth asking Kees to try to leave and then join again? It's one of those sort of turn it off and turn it on again, and then just hope that it works.
I think that's a good idea, because it worked perfectly during your presentation, Kees. So it's something that's happened since. So maybe, yeah.
Well, just whilst you're doing that, I mean, Friedel, do you have any thoughts about that, about contextualizing disinformation in web and social media archives and safe ways to do that?
It's a very good question, and actually in the interviews there wasn't a lot of information that was mentioned. So there was only the Library of Congress who mentioned that they wanted to contextualize it by archiving this aggregating website, but more than that, I'm afraid I don't have any additional information that I could pull from the interviews. But it's a very interesting question, and I know that on a broader level, a lot of archiving or web archiving institutions are trying to improve the documentation that they provide with certain collections. So usually you have a collection description, which outlines the framework within which the collecting has taken place. And then there's also the metadata, the descriptive metadata that can be consulted. But it's a good question, and I think there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done on that level. And I hope, Kees, that you will be able to elaborate as well, since you have more experience with conspiracy theories and how to contextualize them than I do. I hope your sound is fixed by now.
I hope it's better now.
Yeah,
good.
100%.
Very good. Well, as far as I didn't hear what Friedel said. Well, how did he contextualize it? Actually, we had an intern who saw all the websites that we selected and who made a description about it. But what we also did is we made a really big Excel sheet and described all the websites on the way how we saw it at that moment that it was online and that we studied it. So of course a website can have some kind of content, but a couple of years later it can have totally different content. So in this way, it's important that you grab it when it is still fresh and when it has that content that you're interested in. But actually the start of all of it, and it's actually the real context of it, is that there was someone who wrote his PhD on conspiracy theories in the Netherlands. And we took the text of his book, we took out all the URLs, looked up what was Dutch, and this was the start of our collection. So actually, this was the context, the academic context of our web collection.
Yeah, I guess I suppose it's one of the things that we found with our project on COVID rumors and conspiracy theories is that often quite difficult to even define what a rumor or conspiracy is, and that obviously affects, what you include in your archive. And often people will report or repeat a rumor or conspiracy theory, not because they believe it, but because they're doing it for sort of satirical purposes or all kinds of reasons like that. So that's an interesting challenge. There's another question here actually about sort of conspiracy websites and the role of Russia. This is obviously something that's very topical right now. So this is a question for whether any panel members have an opinion about the role of Russia on these conspiracy websites. Do they see any evidence of Russia, I suppose the Russian government, controlling the narrative? Or is it merely that Russian news is attractive to the conspiracy theorist anyway? So Kees, I mean, you're probably the best person to start off with that one.
Yeah, but unfortunately I don't see the questions anymore because I'm not the host anymore, but I can answer it. I think it is because of it gives an alternative story and this alternative is what people want to hear. So I talked about these 500 sites, which the web collection consisted of 500 sites, and of it, almost half of it were quoting Russian news sites and Russian fake news. So the Russian government did not order these people to put these links and this information on their sites. The people did it, I think, voluntary. But I think they did it because it appealed to them, and it gave them a kind of narrative, a ready-made narrative, which they could use against the authority of the Netherlands and against what they call mainstream media. So I think this way it's a kind of, give your friend a stick and he can beat someone. I think it worked like this.
Yeah, do you Valérie or Friedel, do you have any sort of thoughts about that on whether this is about Russia controlling the narrative? We're getting quite broad and political here, aren't we, rather than sort of necessarily about archives. I'm asking you to pontificate about international affairs, I suppose. Yeah.
But I can add something as well. I mean, I've also done research on the Hungarian web archive because I speak also Hungarian. The interesting thing was that what starts in Russia, afterwards it goes to Hungary and then it comes to the West. So for some narratives, I could see the road which the information was traveling. Yeah. That was fascinating to see.
I mean, there are fascinating ethical questions here for archivists, aren't they? Which Friedel sort of touched on already. That question of whether you include fake news or not. It seems to me as an historian, I wish there was more fake news preserved in archives from the early modern period. So the idea of not including that in archives seems like a sort of a travesty to me. But I can understand the ethical problems there. I suppose just picking up on ethical questions about these web archives. I suppose I had another question about the right to be forgotten, which is, obviously something within the EU. There is a right to be forgotten. If you say something stupid on Twitter or whatever, it's not necessarily going to be around, for eternity. And I just wondered about that kind of whether that posed an issue for archives specifically. So, how to deal with the fact that people might put something on social media and not anticipate that it will be preserved forever in a web archive. And the fact that, in fact, the rules might be different in different countries for what you are able to preserve. I mean, do archivists have to worry about getting legal requests to go through their archives and take out certain posts and things like that? I mean, Valérie.
Yeah, and it already happened with Internet Archive, and especially because it is also online and available for everybody. Within the frame of national institutions, which have a very clear legal framework related to legal deposit and so on. The issue is a bit different. They deal with researchers mostly who have also ethical rules to follow, and more within Europe, the GDPR and so on. So we have questions related to anonymization of contributors. You know, when you deal with terrorist attacks, for example, and you have plenty of hashtags related to "I'm not Charlie," of course, and that you can cross it, but we don't do it as researchers because we have also something which is related to the ethics of research, and not as a researcher alone, but also our institutions is also accountable of this kind of, So the right to be forgotten, of course, it may happen. There was at some point a kind of struggle, right, to preserve, right to be forgotten, and right to memory. I don't think for web archives it's so difficult to deal with it when they are, national institutions, but as researchers, of course, we have to be cautious and to deal with it. And I will say, because there was the question by Sarah, who is going to read this? More and more for these types of content, big content like terrorist attacks with millions of tweets and so on, we can't read everything. So we are also using a kind of distant reading with computational tools that may give also trends, tendencies. And in this case, we don't want to put the light on one person or one people who expressed an opinion, but more on tendencies. So this is also something which is, I would say, protecting in some ways individuals. It is becoming more tricky when we, and I don't know if it was with James that we had this discussion related to Trump and Twitter, and so maybe Jane could also react, I guess, because she's also an expert in this case of
Was this really the question around putting people at risk by archiving, the sort of rapid reaction? And I think there was a long discussion on an International Internet Preservation Consortium mailing list about trying not to put people in Afghanistan at risk by rushing to archive websites which might be in danger if they couldn't be sustained or maintained anymore. You might actually be putting people at risk by making that openly searchable in a web archive online. So there are a lot of safeguarding questions around this kind of work as well, that immediacy. But again, as Valérie said, I think it's more of a problem for archives that do immediately make their collections open than it is for a lot of the national institutions who have these safeguards, and there's limitations on the kinds of access that you can have. I can see Kees nodding, so perhaps Kees, you'd like to talk about how that might work in your institution, for example.
Actually, this is the case with our institution. That's the web archive can also only be viewed within the walls of the library, and you need to have a library card to see it, and you can't copy that, you can't bring it outside. So if anyone wants to take down anything, then we have to remove it from the Wayback Machine in our reading room. So this is how it works with us. But actually, but perhaps also good to refer to the question of Julia Shepard. So it's really interesting to see how all these web archives are different from each other. So in preserving stuff, in giving to the people, the problem is always the legal background of every country, the resources which are allocated to web archiving, but also the archive culture. That's also something important. So there are many reasons why these libraries or archives differ so much from each other from the point of view of web archiving. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. So that was the question there. I'm sorry, my internet had some issues. So that was the really excellent question, which sort of picks up on that the issues of having an international means of communication, but national sort of archives, which is whether there's a way of kind of standardizing how web archiving is done. And our questioner said that they were struck by how differently the countries have been working Friedel's chart in Friedel's presentation. So Friedel, I just wondered, have you got an answer to that question? Is there anything being done to kind of standardize web archiving, or just different national archives going about it in their own way?
Well, the thing is that most of the institutions that we interviewed, they work within a certain legal framework, and that can be a legal mission. And most of them have the legal mission of legal deposit legislation. I know Kees, the Netherlands is an exception, since you don't have a legal deposit. So there are rather strict rules that come into play, and for each country, it's a different kind of definition of what is national content, national online content. So I think that's one of the bases as to why these approaches are so different. For example, in the Hungarian legislation, if I'm not mistaken, Hungarian as a language is one of the main criteria for including content into the collections. Whereas for other countries, language doesn't play a role. For example, Switzerland says, as long as it's a Swiss institution or organization or person, we just take the content regardless of the language. So it really depends on what the legal framework is. And I think that's one of the main factors as to why these web archives are so different. And then there's also the question of resources. We have to be realistic. Some institutions have more money and more staff that can dedicate time to web archiving. So if you have a big team, you can be more, how do you say that, more prolific, let's say, and also try new things. For example, the Danish Web Archive, they have a very nice team, and they're really at the forefront and trying to capture new types of content. Whereas other libraries or institutions that have maybe less funds, and they don't have the capabilities of setting up these technical infrastructures that are needed to capture this kind of content. So I think it's a matter of legal frameworks and resources that can explain the biggest differences.
Yeah, it's very strange, isn't it, having a very sort of disaggregated communication system that no one's really in charge of and no one owns, but you know, trying to capture things from a national perspective is certainly a problem that we had with our project, where we were interested in COVID rumors spreading in Britain on Twitter. And then the question is, well, do you include all of these American tweets? Because of course, people in Britain are very interested in misinformation that originates in the United States. We've actually got a couple of really interesting questions about sort of future-proofing, I suppose, and how quickly the internet is changing, and how we can kind of preserve different types of information. So we've got a really interesting question here about how we can archive instant messages like WhatsApp, Telegram, because they seem to be one of the main ways that types of misinformation that you've both discussed can spread, as well as being a key source of communication for people during moments of crisis. I suppose this just reminds me that, you know, the internet itself has changed. This is a real challenge for archivists, isn't it? The fact that the internet itself is changing all of the time. Facebook has given way to Instagram, TikTok, who knows, the metaverse at some point in the future. So yeah, is there any, are we able to archive that sort of stuff, WhatsApp, Telegram? Is there any way to kind of future-proof these archives, or at least anticipate changes in the way that people use the internet in the future? Valérie, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I can start. It's very difficult because you have personalized content, I would say, or private groups, or in WhatsApp. We know that WhatsApp played, for example, a huge role for the propaganda of Bolsonaro during the Brazilian elections, and the researchers that studied this kind of things, they had to do screenshots and create their own, I would say, archive, because it's quite complicated. Telegram is not so much archived, and we are more and more discovering also in the west of Europe with the war that, yeah, of course, a lot was happening on Telegram since a few years, maybe related to Russian or Ukrainian content, but no, it's not so much archived. So of course, web archiving institutions are evolving. They were testing, for example, how to archive Instagram or TikTok during the COVID crisis. But for example, Twitter is easier also to capture than Facebook, but also not for only technical reasons, but also private groups and so on. And so there is a long way to Periscope during the terrorist attacks with these very short videos that disappeared, platforms that may be lost for the researchers like wine. So we are, of course, not preserving everything. And there is a challenge there because when you see a growing platform or which will take place and be very important, web archivists have to adapt. It's not just about technicalities. They are very good in technical stuff and able to capture, but there are also, yeah, this question, for example, of private groups discussing on WhatsApp. You can't archive or preserve all discussions, fortunately, I would say, but yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, Kees.
I want to add to it that there's a difference between web archiving, like what we do as libraries, and web archiving or archiving as what archival institutions do. So for instance, the National Archive in the Netherlands is now archiving WhatsApp messages from politicians. But this is also an interesting point of view. So they really do great job in this. But that means within 100 years, if I look now back as a time traveler, the only WhatsApp messages I will have will be from the Prime Minister and his group of politicians around him. So what kind of image will we have about the Netherlands when we only have this corpus of data? That's still a little bit strange. So I hope that more WhatsApp messages and cat films and emojis and everything will be preserved.
Well, you know, that's one of the wonderful things about the sort of existing traditional archives, isn't it? It's the ephemeral stuff that actually makes up so much of the texture of everyday life that we want to preserve as historians. So cat videos certainly seem to me to have their place. Really interesting question here about, I suppose it kind of goes back to this question of kind of contextualizing the information that's in the archive. So one of our attendees has asked about the fact that the algorithms that Facebook and other social media use are changing all of the time. Their censorship policies are changing all the time. And we can actually think, you know, even in a COVID context, of pieces of information that were suppressed because they were seen as fake news. And then it turned out that they were actually true or might be true. And so various social media companies had to kind of reverse their policies. So the question is, how should web archivists ensure future use of digital archives are made, future users are made aware of the present technological situation, you know, at the time when the web page or whatever was archived. Friedel, do you have any thoughts about that one?
This didn't come up in the interviews, but it's a very interesting question. I think one of the ways would be to create specific collections where this kind of technological situation was very prominent. And then if you provide a good collection description where you can contextualize it and also explain how these algorithms worked, then it would make sense. However, if this content is just part of a more broad collection, then it would be difficult to do so. It's also a question of resources. If you could, for example, decide to add a banner when you show this type of content, and also explain like this with the algorithms, how they worked, and have this information as a pop-up for a viewer to see, but you have to have the resources to detect this kind of content and also create this banner and link this banner to this particular piece of content. So you need to have the staff to do in order to identify it and make sure that it is shown in a correct way. So it's a very interesting question. I'll think about it a bit more later on, but these are my initial thoughts at least.
It sounds like a lot of work, and I suppose the other thing is, a lot of the time the policies and the algorithms are opaque, very deliberately, aren't they? Because they're commercially sensitive, and Facebook doesn't want people necessarily to know what their algorithms or various policies are. Valérie, I've seen you nodding a lot, and you've got your hand up. So what's your thoughts?
I like this question, and I'm currently conducting a project related to online virality and historicizing online virality. And we started by doing a big Excel sheet with the way all platforms, viral platforms, are also curating content and to go behind the scene. And I would say I'm not expecting, as a researcher, web archivists to provide all answers and to contextualize everything. This is not feasible for them. They are already achieving a lot. And as a researcher, I need to also triangulate sources. I need to look in the press, in audiovisual content, plus web archives, plus eventually conducting text mining, for example, to identify disinformation. But it's also my role and my responsibility to be able to know how the platform that was also disseminating this content was also working. It's a bit like if you study just content on the television, but you are not aware of how many televisions in the country, which audience, and so on. This is, of course, difficult, but this is needed. And web archivists can provide all the context that the researchers has also to search for, I would say. But if they may, it's wonderful, but...
Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I hope you don't mind me coming in, but I just wanted a quick example of how challenging that is for web archives. That people may be aware that a while ago, Twitter introduced a new feature which flagged content as this may not be accurate, so you might want to check. And there was a time lag where the Internet Archive was crawling Twitter but wasn't able to pick up that particular feature. So information that on the live social media platform was being flagged as problematic, in the archived version was still apparently unproblematic. And that relied on somebody noticing that there had been this change and then changing the crawling method to make sure that this change in the platform was picked up. And it's a constantly moving target, and is really, as Valérie said, incredibly challenging for institutions that are not very well resourced often.
Yeah, Kees, do you have any thoughts about this one, about kind of contextualizing, conspiracy theories in terms of the kind of policies and algorithms that are operating at the time that they're propagated?
Well, once I was sitting in the plane for a very long flight to New Zealand for a web archiving conference, and then I had seen all the films in the plane, and I was looking on my phone for what did I save on all documents. And then I found that the Facebook hearing, which was in the United States, that the documents were on my phone, and I had nothing to do for 8 hours, so I was reading through all these documents, and it is incredibly interesting to see how Facebook is working, so how the algorithms are working. So I really hope that we will find someone who is working into Facebook who is there behind the machine, and we can do a kind of oral history project and to ask this person, so how did it work, or how does it work, and can you explain us why we as archivists get this result, why people are thinking like this? because the same like the fight between Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, and that they did an experiment in one village. They just pulled out their whole marketing and they just left it for Coca-Cola, and then after 1 year everyone drank Coca-Cola. So these kind of experiments, I'm sure that they are done. So and we really would like to see these kind of results and these kind of data and these kind of stories. So if anyone listening here is working at Facebook, please contact me.
I wouldn't hold your breath for for that one. You never know, though. Yeah, well, I mean, I really like Valerie's analogy there between being able to see a TV program from an archive, but really not having a clue how many people have TV sets or what the viewing figures are, and you can think about sort of how that works with traditional archives of textual material. I suppose often actually we do have precisely that problem with early modern sources, that the fact that a book has been published can kind of mislead us into believing that it's enormously influential when actually no one read it. And that ability to know not just how many times a post has been shared, but how it's being pushed to viewers through archives would be a really kind of important part of the puzzle. I think we have, unless we have any other further questions, I think unless someone tells me otherwise.
There was one question from Tom Nesmith in the chat, which is asking about long-term preservation and whether the digital infrastructure that we have at the moment is adequate. And if it isn't, and I suspect that might be the answer, what's needed to make it adequate? Kees, why don't you pick that up as someone who is at the coalface of this work in an institute?
Why do I always have to talk about this? Please leave me alone. No. Well, this is again something which has to do with a lot of money. So really a lot of organizations are working on it, but digital preservation, especially in the long term of web archives, is still challenging. And there are not so many libraries which have organized in a really good way. So it's something we're working on, but it's something which happens on the background. The general public doesn't see what is happening, but it is. I can tell you that making a website is less costly and less work than preserving it. So preserving a website is there's a lot of handwork in it, and So for instance, in our library, we only have 21,000 websites we've archived in so many years, but every single website is quality controlled. So it's put into the web archive by hand. So that costs a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money as well. Yeah.
I suppose that question of what is needed is a really tricky one, isn't it? I mean, what would you say would be needed to sort of incentivize, make it easier to kind of preserve that? Does this need kind of, I don't know, government regulation or something like that? What would be required?
Yeah, it's the same like the Library of Alexandria. It's according to the story, it was burned, but the greatest danger to it was neglectance. So if we think about it like a society, that it's important for us to keep this kind of digital heritage, and that we understand why it's important, because it can tell us stories about who we were, and we want to give it. We want to give it to our future people to show us who we were. That I think this has to be somehow in the minds of people. And there was another question about the creators of web content. Don't they do anything about digital preservation? The answer is no. Most of the creators of websites, they don't care about at all what happens to their website. And we as web archivists write constantly letters that please, add this or change that, because your website will be can be better archived, but they're just not interested in it.
Valérie, please go ahead.
If I may add, yeah, but some, I will say, web archivists, it's not their job, but they are very interested in it, are the GAFAM, and notably Twitter, Facebook, and others. So there is also the question of also privatization of heritage and the reuse. And so this is, of course, something very important. And related to the question by Tom, which is very challenging, is digital infrastructure adequate? It depends also which kind of digital infrastructure. Entire centralized one, which may be also targeted or destroyed, and it may happen, it may be a fire, it may be an attack, or is not the same as one which is mirrored in several places and so on. The question of emulation is, of course, very important too, and the fact that web archivists are constantly also trying to monitor. But for example, we mentioned the INA for the Audiovisual National Institute in France. They had already the challenge with all the film and with recording and so on. You have, if you want to preserve, to move sometime, your content on another, infrastructure or support, or, and they are doing also it for web archives, of course, because technology formats may change and so on when Flash disappeared, but you have preserved. So there are a lot of work related to it. And as I don't think that we can print the 600 billion web pages of the Internet Archive, and we would lose the interactivity of this. The Long No Foundation and Internet Pioneers are thinking about other solutions, and we may also think about DNA, DNA, and so on in the future. But at this stage, I'm not sure we have a better answer than having digital infrastructures. But if they may be resilient in some ways and so on, that's better, of course.
Lovely. Well, it seems quite a good time to finish then, I guess, with a bit of a sort of a call to arms there. So I'll hand back to Jane.
Thank you very much, David. And I guess it's also a call to arms, but I think this is a topic for another day, perhaps, but consideration of the environmental impact of all of this digital preservation, which is something that we're only really starting to grapple with, and how we can deal with that. But thank you very much, everybody, for some wonderful presentations, raised so many fantastic issues, great questions, wonderful moderating, David, as well, and lots for us to go away and think about. So I'm really very grateful to everybody, and particularly to our audience this evening for spending time with us to talk through these really difficult issues, which are going to be very important for archivists and researchers. And the final thing from me is just a reminder that this was the 4th seminar in the series, and there will be a 5th seminar on archives and authenticity, questions that we've touched on a bit today as well, which will be held in June. So watch this space for some more information about that. So once again, thank you very much to our wonderful speakers and moderator, and for the fantastic questions. Thank you, everybody. Good evening.